And I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight we have with us Monica DeHart, who is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of Puget Sound. And as you can see on the screen, her topic tonight is China in Latin America, paving the way toward development or exploiting opportunities for regional domination. Dr. DeHart has noted that since 2000, China's growing presence in Latin America has been the subject of alternately utopian and pessimistic forecasts about how China is changing the world. On the one hand, China's ascendance as Latin America's second largest trading partner has swelled hopes of a new era of regional development. And on the other hand, the largely extractive, commodity-based nature of that trade and China's own illiberal government have led to worries about renewed dependency and the promotion of corruption and authoritarianism in the hemisphere. So I would like to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Monica DeHart.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. I'm so pleased to be here with you all. Even though virtually, I will confess that I've been teaching all day in a mask in classroom. So the idea of unfettered speech, even if it's virtual, is a welcome one. And I'm glad to accompany you tonight and appreciate the invitation by the Olympia World Affairs Council to share. As you can see, the title of my talk tonight is China in Latin America. That's a little bit deceiving. I'll actually be talking about China in Central America a little bit more. But this picture that I have on the front screen, I think, is a good one to launch us into the topic. It gives us a sense of something that I think many of us are familiar with at this point, which was the 1999 going out policy that the People's Republic of China, the state, decided to deploy as a strategy to send out Chinese firms in the world as well as its products in order to begin to diversify and become more competitive and to really increase its visibility and prowess on the global stage. The picture that you see, though, is really pointing to the 2013 shift in philosophy by the Chinese state, which is to think about a much more ambitious project, and really an ambiguous one, right? The Chinese dream. And this kind of vision is one that Xi Jinping, that you see here, has defined as ideals such as prosperity, collective effort, socialism, and national glory, as well as the goal of becoming relatively well off by 2021 and a fully developed nation by the country's 100th anniversary in 2049. In many ways, this goal feels not so far off, given that China's high growth rates and success in eliminating poverty, which by the World Bank's estimate has gone from 88% poverty in 1981 to 1% poverty in 2018, doesn't seem that far-fetched. And when you add to that what we can see frequently now of China's global prowess in terms of not only its large presence in the market, but also the global Belt and Road Initiative and other large infrastructure initiatives around the world, we can really begin to imagine in some ways this Chinese dream extending itself globally. And that's exactly what stoked some fears, that this dream might in fact replace or challenge the American dream, which has been a largely capitalist and liberal dream around the world. And this tension we often hear of in terms of a potential new mounting Cold War between China and the US, certainly trade wars between China and the US. But I want to talk tonight about its implications beyond those bilateral relations and thinking about it in terms of political, economic, and cultural relations throughout the Americas. In particular, I'll take you back to our previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo here, who during April 2019 was taking a tour of Latin American governments and countries and warned them at that moment, China, Russia, they're showing up at the doorstep, but once they enter the house, we know they will use debt traps and they will spread disorder in your home. On this continent, the United States is showing up as never before, reminding our friends of how much we have in common, of how much our interests align and how much we love you. Not one to skirt hyperbole, Mike Pompeo paints the contours of a new era of geopolitics in which there's these cozy domestic relations between neighbors that have now come under threat by sort of a new kid on the block. At least China, not maybe Russia so much, right? Suffice it to say, I think many Latin American governments would not agree with this representation, certainly not in terms of how much love they're feeling from the United States lately. But over the last several years, this kind of sensibility on the part of the United States is a late come one. They were slowed in many ways to realize that China has really become a presence in the region in a way that it hadn't noticed. It's become a presence, first of all, in terms of trade. When we think about Latin America generally, it has become the largest trading partner for several of the countries in the region, and that's including Brazil, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, and many times the second largest for the others, the US being still for many nations the first largest trading partner. And this graphic that I'm showing you is, I would say, a somewhat rosy picture. It shows you this dramatic increase in trade with China since the year 2000 until now. And it also shows you how that increase persists even in the years of the economic recession, 2008, 2010, and even during the years of now the pandemic. So we can think about this trade with China as being really an economic engine for many Latin American countries, even as we also look at the deficit, right? The difference between the exports to China and the imports from China. As I'll talk a little bit later in the talk, those aren't evenly distributed, but nonetheless, they show a really robust and dramatic rise in trade with China between Latin America. The other thing that this reflects is a massive increase in Chinese lending to the region. The Chinese government, its various banks, the Chinese Export-Import Bank and the Chinese Development Bank, now lend more to the region than many of the multilateral and Western institutions combined. So when we look at these numbers, what they're showing you is the rates between 2005 and 2020 or 2019, I think. So you can see that 62.2 billion was lent to Venezuela by China. And you can see how uneven, again, here, some of that lending has been. It has not gone to everyone in the region, but certain partners have certainly received massive amounts of investment, mostly in infrastructure and energy type projects. Third, when I talk about that infrastructure, I know you probably can't see super in close on these, but this graphic is showing you all of the planned and some executed transport infrastructure projects that China is involved in the region. And just looking at the massive breadth and scope of that should be enough to give you a sense of how dynamic China is as a builder of infrastructure in the region, especially around issues of port logistics, which you can see a little bit more in Central America, which I'll talk about, but certainly in terms of dry railroads and transport across the isthmus and across the continent. So the geopolitical stakes of this change and dramatic change in China's role in the region is especially pronounced in Central America, even though it tends not to be the countries or the region that we talk about most when we think about China in Latin America. In part, that's because China has, again, much larger trade relations with some of the Southern partners, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, like I said. But at the moment, Central America remains the region where China only has, I'm saying only, diplomatic relationships with 3 of the nations, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Panama. The remaining 4 nations of the region maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So this region has dramatically important diplomatic implications for China and for the United States. On top of that, you may remember just this summer, Kamala Harris, our vice president, was down in Central America dealing with another wave of migration from the region and really talking about the fact of the importance of Central American development as a means of trying to mitigate some of the flows of migration north. thinking about who will be responsible for helping to have that development happen and how it happens is a crucial question then, not only geopolitically for Taiwan and China and the United States, but also for the United States in terms of access to the Panama Canal, the flow of migrants from the region, and also really important economic markets there. So in my talk today, I really want to think about how we see China on the landscape in this area and what's at stake in the way that it's playing a role in development initiatives there. I've given you a dramatic title, a provocative title, right? Is it, on the one hand, the solution to Central America's development issues, or is it trying to exploit the region? These are oftentimes the really bipolar terms in which we think about this. It's either the evil axis or potentially it's this benign South-South partner with win-win relationships. But I want to think a little bit more about this from the perspective of my ethnographic research in Central America, which began in the 1990s, looking at development issues, but since 2011 really turned a shift to think about China's growing role in that space. Increasingly, I was seeing that it wasn't North American and European non-governmental organizations or the USAID that was really providing the main impetus for development, but increasingly signs of China. So the research that I've been doing since that time, which involves being down there, doing interviews with politicians, union leaders, everyday citizens, development extension engineers, Chinese bankers, all sorts of folks that are related to questions of Chinese development for many years, has led me to these questions that take kind of a step back from that bipolar position and ask something a little more basic, which is, who is China in Latin Central America? In fact, what is China in Central America? And if China is the one that's doing so much development there, what's really unique about their style of doing development? What should we fear, or what should we imagine as the promise that that holds? What are the implications for the region? This work, like I said, has been undergoing since 2011. And it deals mostly with my research in 3 different countries, increasingly, or actually, originally it was Costa Rica, which was the first country in Central America to recognize the People's Republic of China in 2007. It switched sides from Taiwan to Beijing at that point. I also have done work in Guatemala and Nicaragua, which are 2 countries with remaining affiliation with Taiwan. So one of the things I'm interested in is thinking across the region about the different ways that multiple Chinas are shaping people's ideas about what Chinese development should be and could be for the region. And I hope there's some surprising answers in here that helps us to think beyond some of that dichotomy to imagine some other futures. And I'll see if you agree with that in the end here. So let me start by just walking us through some ideas about who and what is China in Central America. And when I'm talking about this, of course, I'm talking about the isthmus up here, just south of Mexico and north of Colombia, right? These 7 countries. And to think about China in Latin America, again, I have to step back and say, you'll notice from my very beginning introduction, when I was saying China, I was talking all about the People's Republic of China, right? That's the China that Pompeo was talking about and all of the statistics were showing. But when we look at Central America, we actually see at least 3 different kinds of China at work there. One of those is the Chinese diaspora. And this is flows of migrants who have been coming to Latin America from China since the 19th century, originally as part of indentured, or what we call coolie labor, brought over from the ports of Macau and Hong Kong and put to work on plantations originally in the Caribbean, and then brought over into the isthmus to do work on the railroads. These were the workers who built the Guatemalan, the Costa Rican railroads, and oftentimes railroad workers, Chinese railroad workers from the United States, as they moved south or were expelled from the United States with the Chinese Exclusion Act, came down to Central America also to do this work. And so we have a large constituency of Chinese diaspora across the Americas. I put here some numbers, which if you look at the total percentage of the population, looks relatively small, doesn't look like huge numbers, but these are communities of multiple generations of Chinese immigrants, many times clearly established in Central America, and then again, through multiple generations, citizens of the nation, Spanish speaking, as well as maybe mostly Cantonese speaking, because many of these workers came from the Cantonese area of Guangdong region, maybe Hakka speakers. Some of the more recent immigrants that have continued to fuel this diaspora come from Taiwan and Fujian regions of China, but they're highly visible across Central America and Latin America as owners, as they are in North America, oftentimes of Chinese groceries, restaurants. Many of the Taiwanese have import-export businesses. And so they are visible on the landscape. They're dynamic economic actors and well-respected members of the community. In all of Central America, there are also Chinese associations and a federation of Chinese associations that really pull together these communities and keep them in conversation across Central America and make them what I'm going to call an important presence in terms of how many Central Americans have come to know China and Chineseness. That experience has been formulated with these diaspora in their communities, in their cities, in their nations, first and foremost, and that's going to matter. Whoops, a little too fast for you here. Second one here is Taiwan. As I mentioned, four of the nations within Central America remain affiliated with Taiwan, not Beijing. This means that they have embassies with representatives from Taipei, right? And even though in the United States, we may remember a moment when Nixon traveled to China in 1972, and after Kissinger brokered the rapprochement with communist China and recognized mainland China, that Cold War anti-communist politics and the original connection that Central American nations had with Taiwan has lasted even after the United States and many other countries throughout the world and Latin America switched back to mainland China. This really is a holdout area. It's an area of a lot of diplomatic importance for Taiwan, which is why Taiwan's leader, Tsai Ing-wen, has visited many times, and you'll see and throughout my talk, lots of history of aid between the two countries, economic relations and free trade relations, all sorts of ways in which the embassies have supported those diasporic Chinese organizations that I talked about. So really close connections between the Taiwanese sort of governance embassies and also the folks on the ground. And so that you'll see that in many countries like Taiwan, like Guatemala and Costa Rica, also there's a lot of assembly plants or maquiladoras that are owned by Taiwanese businessmen, textile firms and other assembly work that there is done by Taiwanese owners. So there's a lot of Taiwanese presence there, both in terms of sort of civilians and businesses, and also in terms of those diplomatic corps in those areas, and a long history of development support. Finally, of course, there is the People's Republic of China, which again, in 3 of these countries has only become the official diplomatic partner since 2007 in Costa Rica, 2016 or 17 in Panama, and then 2018 in El Salvador. So very, very, very recent switches, right? Nonetheless, as you saw from those trade numbers and the lending numbers, China has been an increasing presence in these spaces despite its lack of diplomatic presence in those areas, right? So that you do have a Chinese embassy with representatives from Beijing in San Jose, Costa Rica, and those other countries. But in many of these places, you'll also see now, in addition to an influx of new Chinese tourists in Costa Rica and other places, representative from Chinese construction firms and Chinese petroleum companies. You'll also see representatives from Chinese banks, right, who are there now headed in Panama, doing business and making loans to do infrastructure across the region. You also see, and I want to really highlight this, intermittent constituencies of Chinese workers who are brought over from China and are there only for the period of the construction job, usually, and kept in separate encampments, but nonetheless are a separate face of China, even though it's a mainland China, a very separate face of what that presence might look like in Central America. So all of these become different faces of China in the region. And as I'll argue again and again, all of them are at work in shaping people's ideas about what Chinese development means, what the Chinese are about, really, and what they might be looking for and what Central America might gain from those relationships. In thinking about these things too, I want to highlight that it's not just these official parties, but also things, right? One of the best ways that people know China and Chineseness in Central America is through commodities and through products. And this includes these massive ship lines full of products that have flooded Central America, like many other places in the Americas. Cheap plastics and shoes and toys and things like that. Things that used to be produced in Central America and exported to the United States are increasingly now imported in from China, along with also higher end products. And we have here, for you soccer fans like myself, Lionel Messi touting the Huawei phones, right? China has a huge presence now in terms of telecommunications and technology commodities in the region. So when people think about China in the region, it is both those sort of low end, less expensive products and also a high number of these higher technology things as well. Another thing people are thinking about are the projects underway. And these are also massive infrastructure stuff. Since 2015, China has announced 45 billion from Chinese banks earmarked for infrastructure in Latin America. There is some serious emphasis in doing this, and many of these projects are submitted for public concessions. So they are actually bid on, public projects that are bid on with other firms that are local, but oftentimes are also negotiated directly with Central American governments as part of bilateral agreements from the very get-go. So I'll talk a little bit about what some of those might look like. Central Americans are used to imagining and seeing things like hydroelectric dams, roads, stadiums, all of these different infrastructure projects that many talked about to me as these first world high-end projects that many felt like they couldn't execute themselves and felt like a real boon in terms of their possibilities for development, but also held within them some contradictions about the way they were built and what they represented as well. Finally, I'll say the other thing that China, how else it's present in Central America is just ideas, right? People have ideas about China over there across the sea in terms of questions of communism. And again, these come not just from watching TV or thinking about the news, but also, again, thinking about the local Chinese diaspora. Many of those Chinese came to the Americas either leaving the communist revolution or leaving in the 1980s and really having not a lot of love for communist China. And so having a very antagonistic attitude towards the Chinese state that in many ways affirms what many Central Americans who feel themselves very close to questions of democracy and freedom and liberalism see themselves as aligned that way. Nonetheless, China for them in some ways also represents a new frontier of growth and technology. There's lots of Central Americans taking Chinese classes now as they want to imagine being able to go do business in places like Shanghai and be part of a more cosmopolitan global landscape in which Central Americans might play a bigger role. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also say COVID, pandemic. A lot of the recent conversation in the last 2 years, at least, has been about China and COVID and thinking about that country both as potentially the source of the virus, but also because China has been waging what they call mask diplomacy. And it has been very active in sending medical supplies, masks, and not so much vaccines to Central America, but other kinds of products to help deal with the pandemic. As has Taiwan. So these are ideas that again come from the North American media, that come from the general media, and also shape people's ideas about what China is. So that you can imagine that China, in many ways for them, has this contradictory set of values that include both really industrious, forward-looking technological prowess, and also worries about some of these very long-standing sort of racist ideas about Chinese monopolistic behavior and suspiciousness and maybe even contamination that were really part of, even in the North American context, discourses about Chinatowns and immigrant populations that we've seen and has simply not gone away here either, especially in light of COVID, as we've seen all sorts of anti-Asian violence, unfortunately, as a result. So all of this is to help describe a little bit some of the landscape in Central America and the multiple ways that people are seeing and reading China and Chineseness in this particular space. My work, though, as an anthropologist is about being on the ground and really connecting with people and talking with them from all these different angles about what Chinese development means. And so for the next part of the talk, I want to think about these multiple Chinas that are there, right? Multiple Chinas, I'm talking about this range of state and non-state actors with diverse and competing interests, histories, and cultural orientations. That's the diaspora, that's Taiwan, and that's also Beijing. And really reinforce this idea that all of them play a role in shaping ideas about what China is and could be for the region. And I'm going to show that through some, again, ethnographic moments that help to take you down to the ground and think a little bit about what this space might look like in terms of Chinese presence and its implications there. And I'll start you in Costa Rica, which, like I said, in 2007, after a year of covert negotiations between its president, Oscar Arias, and representatives in Beijing, switched sides. And as a result of that diplomatic switch, that bargain came with 300,000 or 300 million in bonds, and also a promise to build a new public infrastructure good. And Costa Ricans were given a choice by Beijing. Beijing said, you tell us what you want, we can put aside some money to build you something that you need. And there was actually something of a referendum in Costa Rica. And as you can imagine, or maybe you can't, I don't know, if we had to do this here in the United States, what those two things would be. It was a prison and a soccer field. As you can see, the soccer field won out. People decided that a new national stadium to replace this old wooden stadium would be by far the most attractive gift that China could give them. And so China undertook the construction of this $100 million stadium. It brought over, like I said, 600 workers from China that lived in a small encampment there near the stadium. And to comply with Costa Rican labor laws, workers were only able to work 8-hour shifts, but they had 3 successive shifts. So you essentially had people working around the clock on the stadium in order to bring it online in 23 months. It was built in even a month earlier than anticipated and delivered to the Costa Rican public with much fanfare. Concerts by Shakira, international soccer games with Barcelona, and all sorts of celebration about this new first world stadium. So one of the things that I was most interested in addition to the soccer games in the stadium, which I confessed already, was this idea of Chinese presence in Costa Rica through the stadium. And in talking to people, it was really interesting to hear their ideas about what this thing meant to them. For some of them, for many of them, it was definitely a sign of coming into the first world. They said, now we've got our own first world stadium. Now we can get all the big acts to come down here and events to come here. And we have the best in Central America. In fact, Oscar Arias, the ex-president, when I interviewed him, said, since we got that, now all of my Central American counterparts keep asking me, like, how can we get in with China, right? So they were all quite proud of the stadium in that sense. Surprisingly, some of the Costa Ricans that I talked to also were incredibly complimentary about the Chinese workers. They said they were so industrious. You could see them running back and forth like ants across the top of the stadium all day long. They did things that our workers would never do. Ours would be taking coffee breaks and doing these other things. And these Chinese workers were just amazing. And I want to just highlight, right, there was admiration there for the industriousness, but also just a little bit of denigration as well, right, about these workers sort of being the kind that would do work that Costa Ricans wouldn't do anymore. I'll also say there were folks that were from the working class in Costa Rica who were a little bit, skeptical about the stadium because they couldn't afford the price of entry for some of these big events. And they thought, like, what's the future for us if this is the kind of thing that we're going to build, things that we actually can't have access to, right? And finally, a fourth contingent, I think, was concerned about the role that China played in this process, because they said, this is a Trojan horse, right? Sure, they give us a stadium now, but what are they going to ask for afterward? And they really thought about a gift from China as being really a Trojan horse, a gift horse, right? That you want to be careful about, because it could potentially bring with it all sorts of other kind of strings that we would not want to be attached to, especially Costa Rica, which prides itself on being the longest standing democracy in Central America, a place with no army, and yet also the first place to have aligned itself with Beijing, who many identified as the source of human rights violations and authoritarianism and other things. So there was a real sense among many people of that contradiction. Relations between Costa Rica and China nonetheless developed. A free trade agreement was signed. All sorts of new adventures were planned. Another thing that the local mayor in San Jose designed was a Chinatown, ostensibly to recognize Costa Rica's national identity and the role that diasporic Chinese had played in it. Again, there was a big debate about this. And I'll just say, people on the ground, many of them historical preservationists and others, said, this is not a Chinese Chinatown. There's Chinese here, sure, but this is not the place that is defined by Chineseness. And what the government's doing is trying to impose that on us in order to make favor with Beijing. And there was a lot of debate again locally about what this Chinatown meant, whether it would bring in tourists and make San Jose look like a really cosmopolitan place and curry favor with China, or whether it wouldn't. I'll tell you the spoiler, which is it did not. It failed miserably and was actually kind of within a couple of years, kind of worn down to nothing, diminished to nothing. You, as a tourist, would go stand there maybe, and you'd see this big, beautiful art that was built, and then you'd look down the street and you couldn't see anything else. And when Xi Jinping himself visited Costa Rica in 2015, apparently his front guard went to scout out the places that he would visit while he was there, and he did not visit the Chinatown. Which is telling, I think, that this place that was built in many ways out of respect for the Chinese diaspora was not a fitting place really for the Chinese head of state to visit. He instead went to a coffee plantation to sip some Costa Rican coffee. The other way that we see China and Costa Rica in particular were through some infrastructure projects. And here in particular, the Moín refinery, it's a petroleum refinery that's on the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica. It was a very old refinery. And at the moment of, again, switching diplomatic sides with China, Oscar Arias had negotiated already as part of that bilateral negotiation, the renovation of this petroleum plant. And the idea was, again, to make it more efficient, to produce more oil. And for many Costa Ricans, the idea originally had been attractive because they thought this would be a way to lower the cost of gas. So they would be producing more locally and it would lower the price of gas. The project was taken on as a joint venture so that Costa Rica's own public energy company and Chinese petroleum company came together as a joint venture as Soresco in order to put forward this project. And it went through this long, really labored and troubled history of sort of feasibility plans that were struck down for problems, and another feasibility plan that was actually struck down because it turned out that the firm that had conducted it was a subsidiary of the Chinese firm that was going to do the construction. And so there were all these call foul on this idea that there had been sort of not just favoritism, but a way of corruption in getting the project online when it might misrepresent its benefits. The project struggled along for many years. And in 2016, finally, they decided to call it quits. And the project was abandoned because they could not bring together a solid feasibility plan that everybody could agree upon. And at this point, the Costa Rican public had become tired and very wary of corruption on both sides, both the Costa Rican and Chinese counterparts, and were not willing to invest in a project that at that point was going to promote what they called the dirty energy, right? Fossil fuels, when Costa Rica prides itself on being a green energy and forward-looking space. And so at this point, again, this project died a very public and very embarrassing death. And China actually sued Costa Rica now to recover some of the money that it had spent in the joint venture in order to get it online. So again, not very successful. Another one that I'll point to here is Highway 32, which goes from Costa Rica all the way out to the Atlantic coast. And this was a project that was negotiated as part of a concession. It was not a bilateral negotiation from state to state. But the idea was that this Chinese firm was going to bid the best on the project and was going to put forth the close to $400 billion to do the project. It was going to be done by a Chinese firm, although this time with 60% local labor and 40% Chinese labor, right? So that it would, again, comply with local regulations. The project has been ongoing. It was supposed to have been finished several years ago and continues to this day. Holdups on all fronts have stymied it. These include, actual logistical things in the road. So trying to expropriate property that needs for the road to widen, problems with the landscape itself and the engineering, but also problems in the Costa Rican Congress about approving each next step. Because again, in Congress, there's been widespread debate and suspicion about this, and then a real reluctance to authorize further work in a way that the Chinese firms have really gotten frustrated about. Because they say, this democracy stuff, we can't get anything done. Everything gets held up and we can't move forward with our projects. Right. Meanwhile, the Costa Ricans are saying, we need to make sure that these things are done legitimately, with authorization, with consent of folks that are having property expropriated and so forth. But again, a very mixed bag. Okay. So I highlight these 4 projects just to say things have been happening. They are large projects, infrastructure and cultural projects, but in each case, there's been struggles, challenges that has kept this relationship between China and Costa Rica from really taking off and flourishing in a way that would bring all sorts of foreign investment, which is what Costa Rica would really like to see, is lots of Chinese investment in technology, in production there in Costa Rica, and that has yet to emerge. Let me take you just a little bit, up the way, actually, back to Guatemala, because I just want to highlight one other piece of this. I said multiple Chinas in Central America, and I want to remind us that in a place like Guatemala, which still remains affiliated with Taiwan, there is a long history of Taiwan doing infrastructure work in Central America. You're looking here at a big stretch of highway, again, from Guatemala City out to the Atlantic coast. That was part of a historic highway that was built originally by Jacobo Arbenz, the Arbenz that was overthrown in 1954 by a CIA-supported coup. This highway was supposed to replace, or at least substitute for, the way that the railways in Guatemala were monopolized by United Fruit Company, a North American firm that had taken over and essentially monopolized transport and communication and electricity in the area, all as part of its production. Arbenz authorized the construction of this highway as a go-around for Guatemalans to get their products to market. And Taiwan signed on to the renovation of this project, in part with that very symbolic acknowledgement that this was a highway built around national autonomy and sovereignty and wanting to support that. I'll highlight that the way Taiwan has worked on this, though, has been very incremental. The project has been going since like 2006. And every couple of years, a new stage of the project is authorized and new funds are sort of solicited by Guatemala and received. And then with much fanfare, another stage of the construction happens. And so this project is, again, very well respected by Guatemalans. They will name it immediately when you say, what kind of work has Taiwan done here? They've done the highway for us. But they'll also note, like, it's taken forever, not because of corruption or demands, by the firms or Congress, but just because of the funding mechanism. Taiwan's working with a much smaller budget, and some would say being much more strategic about drawing out the funding to keep Guatemala on its side, right? Knowing that one of the big assets they have is the ability to keep offering development aid to these countries in ways that they desperately need, and in ways that China is not going around doing. China is not just giving aid. It is not doing that. It's giving loans, it's doing construction work with its own firms, but it's not just giving aid, and Taiwan is. So thinking about Taiwan in Guatemala in this sense is important, to see infrastructure being done by other Chinas. I'll also note that the way Taiwan is doing this job is with a handful of its own engineers and all of the other work being done by local firms. And a big commitment by these Taiwanese firms has been capacitating, as we call it, training local firms to do this scale of work. So Guatemalans will also say one of the benefits has been gaining the skills, gaining the techniques, building the value chains in order to do more and more work themselves, hopefully with Taiwan. Again, something they would juxtapose with the kind of work being offered by the PRC, or People's Republic of China, and other places. I want to show you this though, because again, this is stuck in time. This is 2013, so this is not super current, but you wouldn't see much change, if any. You would see decreases in the amount of Taiwan here. This shows the amount of trade that Central America is making between the PRC in blue, right, so mainland China, and red is Taiwan. And you can see in all of these countries that trade with Taiwan is very small, even in the places, and especially maybe in the places that remain partners with Taiwan. This is important though, because I want to highlight that the fact that Beijing is still in those countries. One of the things that I was looking at, for example, this last several years was a series of commercial expos that China is sponsoring, along with the help of a local China Guatemala Chamber of Commerce in Guatemala every year. And this massive event, it's a 4-day event, brings together at this point 25 different firms from mainland China, and puts them here in a big expo for Guatemalan consumers and business people to come and interface with, right? With the idea that even though People's Republic of China does not have diplomatic relationships with Guatemala, they can do business with Guatemala. And indeed, when I would talk with the diplomatic representatives from Taiwan in Guatemala and say, doesn't this bother you? Like, isn't this a problem? They would say, no, we're a democracy. Guatemala is a democracy. We have to let them do business with whomever they want. We can't do anything about this, even though, again, outside of this, and as you'll see, you had flags waving, PRC flags and Guatemalan flags waving in a way that is counterintuitive, given the fact that, again, China has no actual diplomatic presence in Guatemala. Commercially, however, they do. And at this expo, as you see from some of the folks walking around, you had everybody from business folks to families and grandmothers walking around with swag that said, I love China, and Chinese flags as part of this, in many ways, celebration or experiment with Chinese commerce in Guatemala. Some of the things on display at that expo included things like Chinese transportation, right? Buses and cars. Also, again, solar products, electronics, even telecommunications and logistics kind of equipment that police officers and others would use. All different scales of kind of commodities were available there. So as I said, again, families looking just to buy themselves a new sewing machine for their textile, in-home textile business. And then also, again, large scale firms looking for logistics kind of networking to do much more kinds of global work were there. I'll just point to one of the things that I found really interesting about this, talking to folks on the ground in this space, was that Guatemalans walking around were really interested and enthused by a lot of the products. They were interested in how much less expensive they were, at how high tech they were. Time and time again, though, I was told, but you have to watch out for the quality. You've got to look at the quality because, for example, a Japanese car would cost a lot more, an American car would cost a lot more, but the quality is where you got to look for. Right. And when I would say, would you like to see more connection with China? Some of them would say, economically, yes, if they're sending us the parts, but not the whole thing, because we got to be able to make the parts. We got to be able to build our own economy. Or others that would say, the goods, yeah, but not the politics. So there was a real effort amongst folks to sort of distinguish between the pieces of the People's Republic of China that they wanted to see more of and those that they didn't. On the other hand, all of the vendors that were here from these mainland firms were absolutely interesting to talk to too. They were not from the big firms that you might have heard of, Huawei, right, or some of the big tech firms. Instead, many of these were small firms that I had never heard of, that most people had never heard of. And it was their first time out of China trying to sell their goods in a foreign market. So many of them did not speak Spanish or had Spanish-speaking counterparts there with them. And they were there as part of a tour of Latin America. They were doing these expos in several different countries in order to really gain market experience and exposure in the country. So these expos were both about Guatemalans getting to know Chinese products and Chinese companies getting to know how to do business in Latin America. The other thing I'll just highlight about this was that, of course, there was a lot of what we'll call soft power or cultural diplomacy going on, right? And so, for example, I'll just point to that tapestry that you can see over there. This was called the Belt and Road Tapestry, and it highlighted the fact that for years, the Silk Road in China, right, was this source of lucrative commerce amongst people. And today also China offers the world this possibility of new Silk Roads and global growth. Behind this, the center screen here, you see, the old city, the Forbidden City, and also in front of it, this huge model of the high-speed trains in China. And folks were coming and taking photos in front of those, and the juxtaposition of sort of the traditional millenarian, Chinese architecture and commodities, and also the high-tech stuff was really interesting. And part of the way that a big part of this expo was trying to expose people to China culturally, what its different regions were about, what its different ethnic groups were about, right? What its different calligraphy and tea traditions were, so as to make it more appealing. And indeed, many of the people that I talked to, the Guatemalans that were there, said, I came to the expo to see more art. I came to the expo because I love Chinese architecture and things. And in fact, they could care less about some of the other stuff going on, but they were disappointed there wasn't more of this. And those were often the people that would say more of this kind of cultural exchange, less of the political, right? So I want to come back to my lead question then. I've given you all these contradictions, right? Is China in the region a new catalyst for development, or is it exploiting regional possibilities here? I jumped you a little too far. I want to highlight again the idea of infrastructure, and I don't want to diminish the important role that that plays in China's future in the region, right? 19 countries in Latin America have now signed on to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And we saw in Panama emerge very quickly the idea of high-speed trains, all sorts of work around the ports, and in El Salvador as well. One of the reasons that they supposedly changed diplomatic relations was that Taiwan had refused to help them renovate one of their ports. China had come in and they had hoped that China would help them renovate that port. So the role of infrastructure and China's ability to come in and do that was incredibly important for folks in their idea about what it could do. The Chinese development banks have very deep pockets to do that work. And there was lots of talk amongst the business folks that I talked to that these banks were sitting there in Panama ready to dole out money to help build infrastructure that would connect the hemisphere. And they saw that as both a boon and also a worry, right? Depending on their place in it. But it was clearly something that they saw as a potential boon for the region. Let's get here. Oops, this is moving me a little too fast. I will say, however, though, there was also consternation about the possibilities of what this would mean. Over and over again, in thinking about some of these possibilities for infrastructure, corruption was a really important language that many used to express their doubts. And I want to be very clear from the outset that it was not just worries about China being corrupt and Chinese firms being corrupt, but also about local firms, local governments being corrupt when they did business with China. And so many, I remember I told you about the refinery project in Costa Rica and the way that fell apart. The allegations were as much about Costa Rican corruption as they were about Chinese corruption. And so many residents were worried about the way that influence of money and all the new projects would really just be used to reproduce a history in the region of lining one's pockets with all of this big money and not seeing any real development emerge, right? So again, I think there's a little bit of there was a little bit of ambivalence, to say the least, about these things. Sorry, I'm getting y'all off now here. I want to move though to some implications of their contradictions. I don't think we just want to say that it's ambivalent. There are actually some things that I think we can draw conclusions about from some of the stories that I've shared with you about the way people are thinking about China and Chineseness in Central America. Even as I'll say, I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A because I've condensed dramatically, obviously, much of that. One of the things I'll say is that while some of the features of Chinese finance and development here seem really different and new, importing Chinese labor, right? Negotiating these projects at the bilateral level, having Chinese firms do the work might seem very unique. It's incredibly interesting how many of the Chinese development practices actually reflect continuities with earlier kinds of projects done by the US and Taiwan. Again, I'll remind you about the railroads in Central America, which were built by US entrepreneurs, right? Henry Meigs and his nephew, Minor Keith, businessmen who came in and built the railroad, and they became part of a monopoly of US transport infrastructure in the region. And that's an old history. So one of the questions has been, is China really different? Or is it just late in the game? Is it just doing what the United States, for example, did long, long ago? I'll also remind you again that Taiwan, is building roads. Other folks are building roads and have been doing infrastructure work like this. And some of the practices, especially one that I didn't talk about so much tonight, but Taiwanese efforts to wield soft power, to try to convince people of the goodness of staying with them. And I alluded to that a little bit by saying the highway project was renegotiated every 4 years, right? Making people really feel close to and connected to Taiwan, both for the economic benefits, also for the question of democracy, was something that was not new. This was a longstanding practice, and one that Beijing was trying to figure out how to fit its practices into those traditions. Another thing I'll say is that there's multiple forms of China here, right? The diaspora, Taiwan, and also Beijing. And again, people's experience with that on the ground are going to play a major role in shaping what people think about Chinese development. I talked about the Chinatown in Costa Rica, and I would just emphasize that many of the ideas about the Chinese diaspora and people's history with them were crucial to them thinking about what was at stake in that new landscape, that new project in the middle of the city, or the stadium in the city. They would say, we know that the Chinese are, and this was from their ethnic communities and their local communities, they're hard workers, they have small businesses, right? They're committed to their family, but they would also say, they tend to be kind of unscrupulous sometimes. They might, monopolize. And so some of these ideas about China that came from those local sources were really important to shaping their ideas about what the Chinese building the stadium might be up to, right? Or what the Chinese working on the highway might be up to. Same true with the Taiwanese, right? If the Taiwanese have done development in a way that emphasizes training local people how to do the work, then people are expecting now that Chinese development means training us how to do the work. And when Beijing doesn't come through, that becomes a source of tension, that becomes a source of challenge, right? So I just want to say that these multiple forms of China actually do play a role in how people are expecting China to act. And by that, I mean the PRC, and also what they're hoping to get from that process. To highlight that just a little bit more, I will say that there are very real tensions between Central America, and I mean both at the government level and also at the everyday sort of life level. And this is about longstanding racist stereotypes. This sign here, fuera chinos. Chino is a ubiquitous term that would be used to talk about anybody who is Asian appearing in Latin America. And this particular sign is in Nicaragua, where you may remember the large transcontinental canal was going to be built with the help of Hong Kong entrepreneur Wang Jing. There was a lot of long-standing xenophobia and racism that was brought to bear in beginning to object to that project, which was seen as new waves of an old yellow threat or menace, right? And again, I mentioned earlier that these debates about democracy and corruption and rights, not just in terms of the Chinese authoritarian government, but also in terms of local governments and how they would act with China, was really a source of tension. So China was struggling to figure out how to work with Central Americans because they said, this democracy stuff, it takes too long, we can't get anything done. And what's wrong with our firms doing the feasibility study? And governments in Central America are saying, you've got to follow our laws, you've got to follow our practices. And also, what extra money can you give us to make this project profitable? So there were challenges on both sides in terms of understanding and also in terms of expectations about what each side would get from these projects. The third thing or last thing I'll say, I guess, is that one of the ways that Central America might be able to mitigate the possibility that this is an exploitative future for them is by thinking regionally and working together in a way that actually has them sit down together and think, if China's got all this infrastructure money, how do we as a region, use that in order to build something that makes our global status, again, Panama Canal, the Nicaraguan Canal, as this global hub for commerce, right? As the back door to the United States and that the hemispheric sort of security. How can we, really negotiate the terms of this in a way that are future oriented and mutually compatible? That is not happening. Each individual country in Central America is negotiating its own way with China, and each successive regime. So in Panama, for example, the regime that negotiated the change in diplomatic relations is no longer in power. The new one that came on board didn't follow through with a lot of the same projects that the first one did. So again, relationship with China sort of falters as folks are trying to negotiate both national strategies and regime changes within them. Were they able, in my opinion, to consolidate that effort and strategize and not wait to see what China's willing to give, but actually tell China what Central America needs? There could be some real amazing future possibilities. In the meantime, it's a little bit of a wait and see. Certainly not, to my opinion, a terror, a threat of regional exploitation, but also certainly opportunities for lots of confusion and lots of unevenness, and again, potentially unequal advantages as China and Central America negotiate this new future. So I'm going to stop there and give you time to ask the questions for all the things that I had to leave out. But I welcome your questions, and I appreciate your long patience during all this talking at you late at night with the screen. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. That was really, really interesting. We do have a few questions in the chat box. So just a reminder, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to add them to the chat now. And I do want to, I'll ask the first question, but then I do want to let the people who are joining us by phone know that after this first question, I want to pause and give you a chance to unmute yourselves if in case either of you have a question for our speaker. So that's fair warning, so you can work on unmuting yourself. So the first question that we have is, I have a special relationship with Colombia. I think I saw a few new highways proposed. What are the Chinese supporting there?
Yeah, Colombia is one of the newer kids on the block with China right now. It has been a little slower in negotiating development opportunities there, but especially on the Pacific coast side, there's been a lot of activity around developing trans-Pacific possibilities. So again, on the Pacific side, a lot of different port possibilities, roads, public transport, also new innovations that way. Free trade agreements, things like that are what seem to be in the works for Colombia. Although I'll say again, Colombia is kind of coming behind, which can be in some ways a good thing because it's seen the way other countries have negotiated with China and seen what kinds of things it might actually want to ask for, sort of in the line of what I was saying with Central America should do, right? Being strategic. But on the other hand, it is true, I think, you couldn't see maybe so much with the trade numbers and the investment, but it is true that China is dropping off in some ways in some of its enthusiasm for Latin America, and Colombia might suffer from that a bit. For example, the high investment that we saw in places like Venezuela and other places, there was no new investment this year. No new investment in 2020 at least, right? So there is, it's pandemic times, there's all sorts of other variables at play, but people are wondering if China's sort of backing away from some of those original kinds of big investments. What is true is the investments that are continuing tend to be mostly in energy, right? Hydroelectric dams, energy kinds of things, and some infrastructure, and not so much other kinds of projects that might be of public interest or other kinds of public goods.
Great, thank you. We do have someone on the phone who unmuted themselves, so caller, feel free to ask your question.
This is, the question is, you didn't mention, I just wonder if it's still a dead idea, the Nicaragua Canal was kind of a big thing for a while.
Yeah.
But I know it took some hits because the oil tankers are no longer in vogue. So any points on this?
Yes, I would say that was dead in the water to begin with. But that said, there was a lot of excitement about it when I was originally in Nicaragua right after it was announced. Nicaraguans on the ground were super excited about it because they said, finally, we're going to get some development. There's huge rates of migration from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, just like, from Mexico to the United States. Nicaraguans tend to go to Costa Rica for labor and remittances. And the idea that there would suddenly be this transport hub and airports and all of these, sort of technology hubs centered around a canal were really exciting at first. But there's been a massive mobilization by civil society. It includes environmental groups, some indigenous groups, and peasants groups, many of whom would have seen the canal go through their own territory. They filed lawsuits both locally and internationally trying to put a stop to the concession. And I'll say what's important here to note is that Wang Jing and his firm seem to have kind of disappeared. None of the financing came around, all of the stuff that even the sort of engineers that were on the ground seem to have disappeared. But the concession is still in place. And that concession gave the investors the rights to access and use and exploitation to this land, irrespective of whether the canal materialized. So one of the ongoing fights is how to undo the concession so that you don't have all sorts of, insidious speculative stuff happening there that, again, Nicaraguans have no control over in terms of environmental or labor, other kinds of rights. So no canal, but still a lot to worry about there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question is, could you elaborate on the contradictions, in quotation marks, of the large-scale new projects built by the Chinese? Have local populations resisted the projects, and what happened if they questioned the projects?
So I'll go back to Costa Rica, which has the longest history at this point. And again, I mentioned the refinery, which was originally received with a lot of enthusiasm, but was eventually dropped because of all sorts of complaints. Those complaints were at the level of, again, folks working in environmental watchdog firms that said, we don't want to, do fossil fuels. It was at the level of folks on the ground saying, corrupt government, look at our, public energy folks are flying off to Beijing for all this stuff. their protest was enough to push their congressional members to put the kibosh on the program. And so I think they have had real impact there. As far as the Chinatown, local mobilization trying to stop the Chinatown, saying this is an imposition of foreign interests, this isn't Costa Rican, did not work. The mayor pushed that project forward and put it in place, but it really was an idea that had no other support, even in many ways from the Chinese community locally. So even though there was no outright protest, or the protests didn't go anywhere, the project itself died a quick death. In places like Mexico, again, there's been other kinds of projects, a big railway line and a big mall that's been proposed out in the Caribbean area. There was massive protests at the outset by different sectors of Mexican civil society, unions, and politicians. And again, that put the end to the project. It's now been resuscitated and renegotiated in new ways, but I think grassroots and again, political opposition does make a difference in some of those. One other thing I'll just say, in Costa Rica, for example, even with the stadium and the changing of diplomatic relations, people were really upset later because they didn't know this was going to happen. From one day to the next, they're with Taiwan and then with China, and they didn't understand the terms of the negotiations. So journalists sued to get the terms of agreement, the MOU between the Costa Rican state and the Chinese state, made public. So again, just as another example of why people have mobilized to try to get transparency and some kind of accountability in some of these places where they didn't feel they had it.
Great, thank you. The next question is a bit of a two-part question. The amount of funding to Venezuela is quite striking. So first, is this a major part of keeping afloat, or are remittances a bigger part of the Venezuela foreign finances? And second, is this so large in recognition of a sense of a socialist/communist form of economy in Venezuela, or just a lender of last resort?
Yes, good questions. So again, there's been a lot of noise about Venezuela. You saw it at the top of the investment list, right? It's getting all the 62 billion over the last 20 years or so. It is a huge part of keeping the economy afloat. It's been very important. I don't know if it's more than, again, because China has whittled away at its investment over the years. That's the total amount. But it has been a substantial part, especially with the transition from the Chavez, the Maduro regime. What I will say is there's been a lot of debate about whether is it just because it's a socialist country and China's sort of lending to friends, or is there some economic interest? And I think many would say that the economic interest, the oil, that is Venezuela pays for its loans to China with oil, right? They have a loans for oil agreement that is very much to China's interest, because it has a steady flow of oil coming from Venezuela, despite whatever Venezuela's financial problems may be. And there was a longstanding thought that they were buttressing not just the Chavez or the Maduro regime, but actually that access to petroleum. China has, I don't know if I could say soured on it, but at least, come to understand a little bit more of the risk involved, which is why many people say they've backed off now on the funding. And maybe, yes, ideology may play a role, but many would say it's the fact that, China's so interested in the oil that they've continued, and Venezuela has no other options. It is really one of the countries in Latin America who are not able to get financing in the international market without China's help. So places like Bolivia, Ecuador, and others have benefited from China's largesse in a way that they would be cut out of the regular lending market. Hope that helps.
Great. We have a couple more questions. What proportion of Chinese investment in Latin America is in the form of loans? You touched on this, I think, briefly, but.
Yeah, a very large part of it. Although there's different structures for it. So I'm using loans kind of broadly here, because I'll say, for example, again, Costa Rica, what they wanted is foreign investment in the development of, tech parks or firms, private firms there. The way China has tended to work is to have its state banks issue loans to support particular projects for which Chinese construction firms or Chinese contractors win the bid, right? So, for example, in Costa Rica, the road project is essentially a $400 million loan that's given on condition of the Chinese firm doing the actual work, right? So the money is coming to fund the project, and it's circling back in many ways to those Chinese firms who are doing the work. But it's a big part of why the work can happen, because the Central American countries don't have access to the funding in order to do the projects. But China is doing almost no aid. There's no kind of, so I mentioned mask diplomacy. Some things like that are happening where there's humanitarian aid in the sense of medical equipment or masks with COVID. But the kind of aid that the United States or other, like Norway, might do, where they're actually giving money to programs, women's rights programs, or human capacity programs, or things like that, or just disaster relief is not the way China works in the region really at all. And they don't keep a public ledger of aid. They don't classify it even as a category. So you can't track Chinese aid in that way. You can track loans. Boston University has a fantastic database, if you want to go look at it, that they keep up to date, that they try to check like 8 different ways, because there's so much confusion around the actual amount of money that comes out of China in terms of the loans, often because there's agreements that never actually materialize. So there has to be some front kind of and back end accountability to make sure the projects and the loans actually went forward. But again, I highly recommend Boston University, their database on Chinese finance. It's a fantastic way to look at some of that.
Hello.
Hello.
So I think our final question is, are there educational and or cultural exchange between China and Central American institutions? And are there language studies conducted by either side to facilitate commerce and cultural understanding?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. One of the things I didn't mention about Costa Rica is that when it established relationship with the People's Republic of China, one of the first things that China did was establish a Confucius Institute at the University of Costa Rica. You may have heard of the Confucius Institutes as these Chinese funded. They're funded by the Chinese Ministry, the Hanban Language and Culture Institute, and they sit in universities. They're funded by the Chinese state, and they promote Chinese culture and language studies. And then they're eventually picked up by the university, supposedly. So the Chinese state put one of those in place in Costa Rica. And I have to tell you a funny story about that, because when they did that, there was actually already existing in Costa Rica a Confucius Institute, a place called the Confucius Institute. It was a Chinese language school that was doing very well, a private one run by a Taiwanese woman. And so when the Chinese state came in with their official Confucius Institute to go in the University of Costa Rica, they actually sued this private businesswoman in order to have proprietary claim to the name of Confucius Institute. After a drawn out battle, she had to change her name, and the proprietary Hanban gets the Confucius Institute there in the University of Costa Rica. So yes, it's part of a whole bunch of programs sponsored by the Chinese state. There's language, bridge language programs, lots of university scholarships for transfer back and forth to China, both bringing Chinese students to Latin America and also sending Latin American students to China. There's also a huge growth in China right now of Latin American studies programs at Chinese universities as they try to understand this part of the world that really they've had very little connection with. So there are a large number of Latin Americans that are actually going to China now to study on their own accord as well. And that I think will eventually becoming a very important part of the next generation of China-Latin America relations, as you see more folks from Latin America that are trained in China and more Chinese that have trained in Latin America that can do that work. Because one very curious thing is that much of the Chinese diaspora that I mentioned here that's so powerful has been markedly absent from politics, They have not gotten involved in politics at all. And even the economic exchanges that they tend to do with China, they do privately. They are not working with some of these big Chamber of Commerce expos. You won't see them at that. They're working at a different register. So there's all sorts of ways in which there's kind of cross levels at work, but growing bonds between the two sides for sure. And certainly the Chinese state is trying to woo Latin Americans and make it look more familiar and comfortable and appealing for the future.
Great, thank you so much. And that concludes our questions. Again, Monica, we want to thank you for your time tonight and for this incredibly interesting topic that you've shared with us. As a reminder to anyone out there who'd like to watch it again or share it with others, the recording will be up on the Olympia World Affairs Council website shortly in a couple of days. Give us a minute to do that. I do want to share some information about our upcoming October speaker. On October 21st, so the third Thursday of October, we'll have James Lin from the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. And an interesting tie in to tonight's conversation, James will be speaking about relations between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. So we encourage you to join us again, the same time, same place. We do intend to have our speakers at least through December exclusively on Zoom. We had hoped to move to an in-person or hybrid model, but due to the resurgence of the COVID situation, we've decided to remain entirely on Zoom at least and through December. So we encourage you to join us and bring your friends. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you again to our speaker, Monica DeHart.
Thank you again. It was nice spending the evening with you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.